The science of murder, the analysis of dangerous new psychedelic drugs, and the fingerprints and trace evidence left behind by suspects at crime scenes are just some of the topics that I'm going to be discussing with a panel of forensic science investigators later this month. And you can come along for free. A special public event to celebrate 50 years of Forensic Science Ireland is going to take place at the National Convention Centre in Dublin on May 28th. The doors are at 6 p.m. and tickets are available now on eventbrite.com. Don't miss it.
Well, will I read you out an email I received from a listener who had watched your ad that you put up about us appearing at the Kilkenny Law Festival without my permission, by the way. You didn't seek my...
No,
you want to have a look over that?
What does it say? Don't read it out for the listeners.
So,
just read it to me.
An intimate evening with myself and Niall. That made me laugh. It's like she's inviting the audience to a threesome.
Only a Crime World listener.
No.
Did I get the wrong tone in the whole thing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I did get a few...
did you?
Well, there was also a comment on YouTube.
Yeah.
Something along the lines of an intimate evening with Niall and Nicola. Sounds great. Only if Niall agrees to wear his Batman suit.
Now, you're really lowering the tone here because this is a law festival.
It is. And
we have to be really highbrow at this.
It is. It's not like, there isn't a specification about which Batman, of course. Would it be the Adam West from the 60s or the more modern Kevlar Christian Bale? I don't know.
I just hope you're more appropriate when it comes to the actual show.
And
you're not reading out our crime listeners.
Because there is various retired. There is various retired judges and things like that.
Yeah.
And then of course ourselves.
Not I
wonder. Yeah. Well, look, we'll see if there's been a spike in ticket sales.
What would you have said?
I would have said, I don't know. I wouldn't have gone for an intimate evening.
I love
Especially after you've already spoken about your swinging videos and all of that you're catching on TikTok. I tell you though, if you see the ticket sales skyrocket, we'll know that. You know why.
Dear, maybe I should have just thought about that first. NASA, I blame you. Right. Are we going to do a podcast at all?
I think we will.
Okay. So, right, let's watch.
In fact, there's actually a great link because it was a sort of a relationship triangle that led to this situation in Limerick.
That looks like something you'd see on reality TV from the States, from a cops show or something like that. So there's a young guy in the front of a car firing randomly into the night air. You can't really see whether there's any pedestrians on the footpath.
Yeah.
And this is all happening around April Collins's house, the former state witness who gave evidence against the Dundons in those trials back in 2013, 14.
Yeah, there actually was a number of trials in the end. But so this is obviously on Hyde Road, where both the Collins and the Dundon families have lived. Now, I actually looked up recently how many stories we've done on shootings, various levels of violence. It's something like, I think it was around 12 over the last couple of months, where there's this constant flow of...
All there in Limerick.
All in that part of Hyde Road. So it's a constant ongoing feud. Obviously, because nobody has been shot or very seriously injured, it just becomes these brief stories and people hear a bit about it and it's, connected with this feud. But it's a really, really severe situation when you can see that video tells its own stories when shots are being fired at homes like that. I mean, the Collins family home has come under attack, serious attack again and again.
Is this going back to the fact that she gave evidence at those trials all those years ago now? I mean, a number of people are serving life terms in prison because of it. Some of the Dundons are before the court. Some of them are just remain in prison. There's 3 brothers who are serving life sentences, and Ger Dundon is in the UK on kidnap.
Yeah.
offences, serving a sentence for kidnap offences. His father is back in Limerick, involved in some sort of a row over a licence.
Yeah, he's back in court bringing a civil action after he was refused entry to a pub because of his reputation, I suppose. And he says it's not justified.
Right.
But I think it is directly connected with what happened basically a decade ago.
Yeah.
The Collins, the father of April Collins, Jimmy Collins Sr., was a very close associate of the Dundon brothers. In fact, there was on one occasion these peace talks, and Jimmy Collins represented the Dundon McCarthy gang at that point.
Peace talk was with who?
With the Keane Collopy faction.
Oh, right,
I don't know if you remember, there's a picture standing out with some of the Collopys and some of the Dundon McCarthy representatives, and they shake hands and call time on the feud, and Jimmy Collins Sr. is one of them. So he has a really long-term association with the Dundons. But obviously that all went wrong over various complicated things, but basically because April Collins broke up with Jared Dundon and moved to... fell in love with another man, Thomas O'Neill.
Didn't move is the point, because they all still live in the same area, which is off Hyde Road, so main route into Limerick. But that happened before. So April Collins was only a young teenager, when she started into a relationship with Jared Dundon and actually moved, I think, into one of the Dundon's homes. She had a number of children with Jared Dundon. He was jailed. I mean, he's been in and out of jail quite a lot, but he was jailed at one point when she decided she wanted out of the relationship. And this is all prior to 2013, when John Dundon would have been facing trial for the murder of Shane Gagan, along with Barry Doyle, and when his brother Wayne Dundon was facing charges in relation to the murder of Roy Collins, along with Nathan Killeen, his brother-in-law, the brother of Ciara Killeen, who's married to John Dundon. But before that sort of happened, there was this falling out because April wanted to break up with Ger. Didn't she tell him in the prison? Or
she told him in the prison. She went into the prison to tell him. There certainly was, because prisoners are allowed they're allowed a phone call a day or whatever. There was recorded conversations of her speaking to Jared Dundon about it. Basically, she wanted to get back with Thomas O'Neill, who she'd been fell in love with before meeting Jared.
Before all that?
Yes, before all of that, as a 13 or 14-year-old, the one that got away effectively. Now, Jared Dundon didn't take it well, to put it mildly. Went berserk effectively and
smashed up a cell, didn't he?
Smashed up a cell. Threatened to get the kids taken off her. Said that they were going to be given to Wayne Dundon to raise. But of course, in the meantime,
an interesting argument.
Would have been an interesting argument.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Wayne and John, who've been serving a sentence, a relatively lengthy sentence in connection with threats issued, they got out, and John Dundon and Wayne basically called down to the Collins home and said, "You're not allowed to break up with him. That's not going to happen. That's not okay." And ultimately, there was a series of incidents, threats made, but when it came to it, April Collins and her mother Alice both gave evidence against the Dundon brothers.
And her brother Gareth and the father Jimmy Collins separated. They moved away from the Dundons. They had been, certainly Jimmy had worked as almost an enforcer for the grouping, and they sort of severed their ties.
Yes,
at that stage as well.
And of course, ultimately, Thomas O'Neill would come out of prison. He had served a very lengthy sentence for what's known as the Cratloe Woods rape, a very, very notorious incident where a tourist was out for a walk with her boyfriend, and she was gang raped by a group of men, including Thomas O'Neill, who was just a teenager at the time. So when Thomas O'Neill came out, he brought a couple of people from prison really with him, people that had come, very notorious criminals in their own right. He had other people that he'd grown up with, and they kind of formed this other criminal organisation, also on Hyde Road, the Dundon McCarthys were severely curtailed by the fact that, as well as the Dundon brothers, people like Red Larry McCarthy also went to prison. So there was a much lesser grouping of them than had been the case. So there's basically two groupings operating on Hyde Road, centred around this dispute between the Collins and the Dundon brothers, even though many of the original players aren't there. Now it becomes more complicated over time. Certainly there's other people who are, I suppose, more removed from the Dundon McCarthys also became involved. There's been a constant stream of incidents over years and years. Very recently, we did a story about a young woman's grave who was being smashed up. She had a, peripheral link to some of the people involved, but terrible trauma for her family. So there's just been this constant stream of incidents. I don't know if you remember as well, we covered it at the time, this explosive incident close to the Collins home as well, where a bomb was let off.
What a way to live your life. I mean, honest to God. And April Collins had packed so much in, hadn't she, throughout her teenage years? When you think about it, she'd had a relationship with O'Neill and broken up, had a relationship with Ger Dundon, had a few kids with him, got back with O'Neill. She's still only in her young 20s, I think, when she gave evidence from memory in court. And that relationship with him has continued. He's in prison at the moment.
He's in prison. So
would that weaken them in a way a little bit? Or are these drive-by shootings happening anyway, whether he's in or out of prison?
There's a constant stream of incidents. I mean, it is quite incredible. There are obviously younger people becoming involved. A lot of the people carrying out some of these incidents would be very, very young men. Some of them wouldn't have been born or barely born when some of these, the origin of these things occurred. Thomas O'Neill is currently, actually, we had a story from Pat O'Connell on the weekend in the Sunday World about the fact that Thomas O'Neill had been moved to Cork Prison, put on the same wing as Desi Dundon. Amazingly, raising tensions in that prison because Thomas O'Neill had been caught with a shiv in the Midlands prison. So they're all having to be kept apart in this prison system. The Dundon brothers have been moved constantly around.
It is unbelievable, this sort of the drag they are out of the state, the state's resources. I mean...
Yeah, and even if, this might not sound like something that makes sense, but you see the latest crime that Thomas O'Neill is behind bars for.
Yeah.
So even though they're causing this horrendous or involved in this horrendous wave of violence, certainly posing a huge threat to the public.
Yeah.
Thomas O'Neill is currently serving a 2-year sentence. And I think the total amount of drugs he was caught with was €616 worth.
Right.
So he was caught on CCTV basically selling drugs out of the back of a car. He was caught with 10 bags of cocaine he was caught with 23 deals of heroin and 18 bags of cocaine. And when he was arrested, he said it was all for his own use. He was smoking 10 bags of heroin a day, and that he just had the bags for bird feed.
So they're essentially street dealers.
They are street dealers.
Causing absolute mayhem. I mean, can you imagine how much they're pulling on the resources of the Gardaí, on the prison service?
Yeah.
The Dundons in prison have caused constant chaos. They've had to be moved around. They've had to be transported here, there and everywhere. What do you do?
I don't know. It's a very complex situation because obviously the young people become involved and they're by their nature more reckless. There's obviously far more serious criminal figures in Limerick that have managed to make money and stay away from this sort of stuff. But yeah, you're right. This is the drag on the resources of the state. There's constant patrols. We've seen, the guards are doing a really good job.
And I presume people still don't want to live beside them. In the way that when they were kind of at the height of their powers, they actually sort of literally ran people out of the neighbourhood so they didn't have neighbours.
Yeah, I think there was
in social housing.
Yeah, there was obviously a house, I think it was it Ireland's cheapest home?
Yeah.
But you were living next door to Wayne.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? It was a house that went up for sale and couldn't be sold because,
But sure, some of the houses along and beside them, and not just Wayne, but John and Desi as well. Desi, who has, a house there. He's been in jail since he was about 20.
Yeah.
serving life in prison for the murder of Ciarán Keane. Like, there were houses burnt out up and down that road. There were people terrified of them. Then, there was the crackdown, which, if you want to look at it financially, what did that cost?
Yeah.
And they were broken up, and the community has been, better served that they are in jail.
Yep, absolutely.
These toxic personalities. But then there was the rejuvenation of the areas. Really, look, that was needed. You can't just blame them on it, I suppose. But there was millions and millions sank into that. And that's at least good use of state resources for community projects and for kids, and to kind of try and get them away from that sort of gangland thing. But I remember being down in Limerick, it wasn't, well, it probably was longer than I think. But anyway, and, in Moyross and some of the other estates, part of that regeneration project was to knock down houses.
Yeah.
And so there was, one house belonging to a sort of an associate of all these people who had refused to leave. And this house is sitting on its own on a hillock in, one of these estates in Limerick, surrounded with fencing and everything else. And it's a social house.
Yeah. I mean,
and the state are paying for this guy and his family to still live in it, despite the fact that he would be one of the top targets of, like, it's a ridiculous situation. I'm sure it happens in every country.
I'm sure it
I've
does.
no doubt it does. It just feels very stark in Limerick. And at the time that April Collins split up with Ger Dundon, when all this big kind of feud broke out really with them. And I mean, they are literally living. You could walk from one house to the other, you know what I mean? They're at either ends of the road.
You can almost see the houses from each other, though. You probably can't.
But she was sort of urged really to move away, and especially in the run-up to her giving evidence and the aftermath of it. She was a state witness. She refused to move. She stayed put in that house. Obviously, it was near her parents and her sister and various other people. And she pretty much refused to cooperate with even the security detail that was placed on her. But for a long time, I'm sure it's not the same now, but there was a car outside that general area in the same way we would have seen a car sit for years outside Champions Avenue. The cost of that and at 24 hours, it's just...
I mean, it just shows you how deeply these problems can become embedded. As these shots are fired out, these incidents occur again and again, these explosions, windows being attacked. In the middle of all that, if you drive down Hyde Road, you see loads of kids out playing.
Yeah.
And they are being ultimately subjected to seeing this or living with the consequences of this. And it is very difficult.
And it's obviously not good enough for them to just sort of do it and hope that it makes media. They now have to film it themselves just in case anyone missed it.
Yeah, and you get young people getting sucked into criminality at a very early age because these things are going on. And we did see some of the...
Was that video shared around WhatsApp groups?
It was shared around WhatsApp, yeah. But you see some of them. I mean, we saw that hit and run case earlier this year where Joe Drennan, a young student, was killed by a hit and run by a guy called Kieran Fogarty, who was 21, who'd been involved in all of that feuding that's going on in that part. He's from Ballinacurra Weston. So, people get sucked into these things, and all of a sudden there's collateral damage. But yeah, the guards have done a good job to keep a lid on it, but it must be a very complex situation.
Wearing,
to
say the least. Of course, that whole drug intimidation isn't only going on down there, or intimidation by youngsters. There's an investigation at the moment, only this week in Dublin, after sort of another feud is sort of bubbling, because I spoke to Ken Foy recently about a number of feuds that are happening. One in the sort of Ronanstown, Clondalkin, West Dublin area. There's another one obviously in the Finglas area. And then you have that sort of, you don't like saying any of these feuds have teetered off in case something happens, but Blanchardstown has taken a lot of resources in recent years as well. But here's another one that young associates of Brian Rattigan, who of course was released from jail, was it last year or the year before?
Probably the year before.
Yeah, the year before at this stage. Anyway, Rattigan, who was one head of the Crumlin warring gangs, he went to war with Freddie Thompson and members of his organisation who would later go on to become the Kinahan cartel, or key members of it. But there's a man who he was chased, I think, and had his face slashed.
Yeah, I mean, the Rattigan situation is kind of unusual, I suppose, in that Brian Rattigan has very much remained a figurehead for a group of young criminals. Some of the people, while he was in prison, he continued to have a role in directing that criminal organisation. He had a lot of people that were allied to him who were a good decade or more younger. Some of them had their relatives that also been involved in the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud. And they really controlled a sort of network of street dealing networks, I suppose, around various places in the south inner city. So again, you see, I suppose, in some of these things that these feuds carry on. But yeah, Brian Rattigan, there was a murder, of course, one of the only. Well, was it a gangland murder in terms of the death of Josh Yetzelli last year? Josh Yetzelli was shot and died in the back of a car in Drimnagh. No, there hasn't been any, and nobody has been charged with the crime as of this point, but it appears that he may have been shot accidentally. There was a car crash and a gun that was being carried in the back of the car went off accidentally and he was killed. But again, the Rattigan organisation are suspected of, being involved in the supply of that weapon. So these people, they have access to, due to their connections with these serious criminals, they have access to firearms, and it can be very, very dangerous. They're mentored into this life. Brian Rattigan is still suspected of playing a significant role, but
it's interesting, really, those two incidents we're talking about, Limerick and Dublin, and there's many, many more, but both the kind of heads of those organisations are in the game for nearly 30 years. We've been talking about them for decades at this stage. They're still influencing younger people to carry on their legacy, be they in jail or outside it. Brian Rattigan certainly hasn't been a very public figure around Dublin since his release. I think he's been probably outside the country for a lot of that. But there is that element that they're able to continue to poison the communities, isn't there? And, these figureheads are, until they die, they're going to be still, part of the tapestry of life and the bad parts of it.
I mean, Brian Rattigan has always been able to command this amazing loyalty, because a lot of these people go into prison and that's kind of the end of them, especially after a couple of years. They kind of maybe get forgotten. But Brian Rattigan has certainly commanded that loyalty. And there are parts of Dublin that, the street dealing that goes on has been directly controlled by him. And of course, he was convicted of that while in prison, directing a heroin deal. Ultimately, he was sentenced to a very lengthy sentence in prison. So yeah, these guys, it's amazing. These feuds get handed down through the generations, and while they can go quiet, they can spark up. I mean, the situation in Rolandstown is quite dangerous, and again, in the background, maybe not a very direct hand in it, but would be John Gilligan again,
Yeah. I was talking about him earlier in the week, and yes, he's still sort of, his tentacles go into so many areas. And
now, he may not have had that sort of direct control of it in the way Brian
There's an influence there, a mentoring, isn't there, even as a kind of a figure.
And connections being made through this somebody like John Gilligan, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that.
Thanks very much.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.